In this segment, I will explain the coming of the Great War. How did a relatively peaceful period ended and all the major European states found themselves fighting one another in what came to be the first total war of the modern age. Now, before I begin, I should remind you the point that when I say that Europe suffered a period of relative peace, not suffered, underwent through a period of relative peace from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to 1914, this didn't mean that there were no conflicts. The conflicts, though, were in the periphery of the European continent or in the colonies, in the colonial world. They were not at the heart of Europe. Now, let me begin the story from a quite remarkable event that happens in 1903. And this is the formal end of years of antagonism and animosity between Britain and France. And this is marked by the conclusion of the so-called Entente, which means friendship, which was a treaty that was signed between Britain and France in 1903 that brought these two countries together. You may remember from your overall readings or from school how Britain and France were British and French were from the period of the French Revolution onwards bitter enemies. However, this brings together the two states in a way that was not quite foreseen in the 19th century. And why they come together? And a part of the reason is Britain's, how to put it, suspicion of Germany, or or in other ways, there's an undercurrent in British policy making, and not only in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, that Germany is aggrandizing its power and it is coming up, proving to be a rival in the colonial world as well. And then one step that would further solidify Britain's position in the world would be to come up with some understanding with France. And also France is also suspicious of the role of increasing role of Germany in the world. So what we have in this period, the early 1900s, we have the crystallization of two broad coalitions. One is between France and Britain at first, and this is Germany and Austria-Hungary on the other hand. What I have chosen to show you here is a very interesting, and you can also see it in the PowerPoint at your own leisure in a bigger iteration. A comical map of Europe from 1900s, where it kind of depicts how Britain looked at the world. So what you see in the main stage here is the Tsarist Russia, a place, not quite a place of progress, that is portrayed like this octopus, kind of extending its reach or trying to extend its reach in a vast part of the world, including Eastern Europe, and see how the octopus grabs Poland. Then we have Britain, John Bull and his friends, and there you see how France is kind of looking towards Britain, as it were, and on the other side of the map, southeastern, you see the Ottoman Empire and the different other kinds of different dynamics fighting, and the German also Kaiser being impersonated somewhere, right in the middle of in Central Europe, looking towards France and Britain. So this is pretty much how it's a pictorial kind of introduction of the kind of antagonisms that we have in Europe in this period. And I should say that these antagonisms are antagonisms about power and about empire. And this is important to note. What happens? This is it's a very complicated graph, but I think it gives us a good introduction of the different degrees and kinds of alliances that we have in Europe in the run-up to the First World War. It's a bit mind-boggling. You need to take your time with it. Russia and France have formed an alliance early 1900s. Again, here the enemy, as it were, the common enemy, quote unquote, is Germany. Britain forms an alliance with France to promote trade, but also to gear up in the event of German aggression. And what is very interesting here in that in 1907, Britain again breaks precedent and forms an alliance with Russia. And this is important because throughout the 19th century, Britain has been exceedingly afraid, quote unquote, of the Russian position, especially the Russian position with regards to Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, because of the need to maintain the Britain's possessions in India. So Eastern Mediterranean and the place around where the Ottoman Empire is becomes a very important strategic place for Britain, and they are afraid of Russian influence extending down that region and maybe eventually blocking the passage of Britain towards India. However, what happens in the early 1900s in the diplomatic sphere is that we have these kinds of alliances that are being created to protect each country's interests. And this creates a camp, as it were, known as a Triple Entente. Britain, France, and Russia are forming alliances, and part of these alliances stipulates the need to militarily help one another in the event of war. Now, what happens on the other side of the map, as it were? Here, the main player is Germany. And as I said earlier, what happens with Germany in the early 1900s is that, as many other European states, the German states that are being united into one federation under Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm, seek to follow what they call a Weltpolitik in German, Weltpolitik, which means a world politics, which means they have plans for imperial aggrandizement to maximize their own empires outside of Europe. But the problem is that these plans, that to some extent are normal plans, all big European states are doing these things, especially France, Britain, and Italy to some extent. These plans are perceived to be antagonistic by other big players like Britain and France. And gradually, Germany is building alliances with its some regional kin countries like Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is a very complicated, weird entity that is comprised, it's called the dual monarchy, is comprised of what is now Austria and what is now known as Hungary. It's some kind of like a dual state, imperial state. So obviously the operating language in Austria is Germany, and there's many reasons for which Germany is closely allied to Austria-Hungary, not least because they share a vast border. And then Italy kind of joins this alliance. And towards the towards the beginning of the Second World War, of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire joins the so-called Triple Alliance. And now what happens? What is the problem? Okay, one might say, right, great, we do have now uh, these opposing camps in Europe, Germany, and places around there in Italy, Russia, Britain, and France. And these opposing camps do have a certain suspicion for one another, but nonetheless, there's no need for an outright war, is there? Now, what is the trigger? The trigger lies in the middle of this kind of bubble, mental, not monumental graph, and it's the Balkans, Bulgaria and Serbia. And an event happens in June 1914 that would have massive repercussions for the rest of the world. And nobody really imagined it as such in the summer of 1914. What is that event? The assassination of the then Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, who is said to be the next in line to succeed the aging Emperor of Austria-Hungary. And by whom is this person assassinated? By a Bosnian nationalist in Sarajevo, a place you probably may have heard of, that we shall also see when we talk about the 90s. So that assassination has a magnitude of repercussions. And most importantly, what it does is that it triggers this system of alliances, and effectively it renders the European states, it turns the European states into war with one another without necessarily wanting to do so. And I will explain in a moment how this happens. But before that, a bit of context. Why is it that the actions of some kind of nationalist person in the Balkans have such big repercussions? To understand this, we need to think about it slightly broadly. What is going on in the Balkans at the time, in a place like Bosnia-Herzegovina, and how is this relevant? Let me try and be as clear as I can, although it's a rather complicated subject. For years and years, Bosnia-Herzegovina is a place that is somehow, let me put it this way, trapped between two empires, Austria-Hungary on the one end, the Ottoman Empire on the other end. For reasons that I don't want to elaborate further on right now, Austria-Hungary assumes the management of this region. So the Ottomans recede, and then Austria-Hungary assumes, Bosnia-Herzegovina, you can see it on the map, it's in the Balkans, becomes some kind of a little colony, how to put it, of Austria-Hungary. And local people in that region, really what they want is independence. What they want is to be united with Serbia, who is nearby and is already an independent state. So they do not really like the Habsburg, as Austria-Hungary is called, rule in the region. And most importantly, you need to remember, Serbia is very close to Russia. Same culture, same religion, and the Serbs and nationalists operating in places like Bosnia-Herzegovina think themselves as subjects of the protection of the great Tsar. So the fact that a nationalist who wants Bosnia-Herzegovina not to be part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire shoots the successor to the Austrian-Hungarian throne has massive repercussions in that period, because then Russia starts being mobilized. And the world turns into something like what you see right now in this picture. And I will try to explain here how this system of alliances that I described in bubbles turns into what we see right now in the summer of 1914. So basically, what is the trigger? Austria-Hungary, the state, the imperial state, needs to respond to this act of aggression. And the response is that they are mobilizing, and need to further tighten their grip in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, in relation to this, Russia, who was very invested in the region, starts mobilizing as well. Austria-Hungary, as I said earlier, also has a treaty with Germany. This also triggered Germany to begin mobilizing. And there are plans in Germany for a quick, as it were, war with France towards via Belgium. Because the German kind of imperial bureaucracy at the time finds it a very fruitful endeavor that will further solidify Germany's position in Europe. And France is contractually obligated to assist Russia in the event of an attack on Russia, and at the same time wishes to protect its own borders, and any aggression towards Belgium, which is kind of between France and Germany, will trigger a French response. And what is the case now with Britain? As you remember earlier, Britain doesn't quite want to drag itself in a war. However, the problem is that Britain has signed treaties with Russia and France. So in the event of a German aggression, then Britain would have to, or a German or an Austro-Hungarian aggression, Britain would then have to join the fray. And this is pretty much what happens and how the war begins. What's interesting to remember here is that in June 1914, nobody really thinks that this minor incident, albeit important in the Balkans, will get everyone fighting with one another. But as we progress to September and October 1914, the fact that Germany is making a move to Belgium, Russia is declaring the war in Austria-Hungary, leaves no option to France and Britain. France joins the war, enters the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary in support of Russia. And then Britain is left with the question. And the question is, do we do as Britain did in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, that's to say, keep our hands out of continental affairs in Europe and try to be the brokers of some kind of peace? Or do we enter the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary because we have a contractual obligation to help assist France and Russia? And this is the state of debate in Britain in September and October. And the side that wins is the side that projects an image of Britain as the upholder of morality and progress. At the post of honor, the triumph of what happens, they say, is that Britain has to come in Europe and help those in need, such as Belgium, and crush German militarism, as you see in the other panel. So in the other image. So what happens in September and October 1914 is with Britain's entry in the war, is in the conflagration, is an all-out European war that gradually becomes a world war when the Ottoman Empire, for instance, is involved as well later, and will have incredible repercussions for the shape of the European continent, because it will mark the end of some empires like Austria-Hungary, like Russia, the transformation of Russia, like the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, Russia. And it will also transform Britain and France in different kinds of ways, as we shall see when we talk about the 1920s and 1930s. So I hope I have tried to explain, I have explained adequately a very delicate international political situation. The trigger is the event in the Balkans, and then how that trigger sets into motion a system of alliances that bind all these big European states together. The last thing to note here before I close this section is that in 1914 and 1915, people think that the war will be a short one, that it's some kind of a cathartic moment, a moment of reckoning for the whole European continent. A short war will be fought, and then, depending on what your allegiance is, some European country or alliance will win, and then Europe will move forward. That's not the case. The war drags for long. Literally, people are being trapped in the trenches. The war also marks the transformation, the seismic transformation of the world, with the collapse of the Russian regime and the emergence of the Bolshevik Revolution. The war also marks a traumatic moment that still today is remembered not only in British and European heritage.